Welcome to Research Radio, the official podcast of Contrary Research. I'm your host, Kyle Harrison, general partner at Contrary. For more info, you can check out our full research reports at research.contrary.com. As many of us know, the battle between remote work and working in person rages on. But as people continue to figure out the best way to work within their particular company, there's one thing that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, and that's visual collaboration. And I'm not just talking about whiteboarding in a brainstorming session. Visual collaboration extends across project planning with things like flowcharts and systems design. There's a lot of information just floating around people's heads, and we're pretty far from being able to just leave it there. Companies need to get that information out of people's noggins and into something that will stick around longer. But when you think about visual collaboration, you might immediately think of companies like Miro or Figma, but you may be less familiar with Lucid. So for those of you who don't know, it may surprise you to hear that Lucid is a behemoth in visual collaboration. The company's been around since 2010, and they've grown to 60 million users, over 100 million of revenue, and was last valued at $3 billion. And on top of that, 99% of Fortune 500 companies are using its products. I'm talking about Google, Amazon, Starbucks, Audi, and on and on. So to dig into what the fuss is about, I sat down with Lucid's current CEO, Dave Grow, to unpack both the world of visual collaboration going forward and specifically Lucid's place in it. All right, Dave, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm excited to get to chat.
Likewise. Great to be here. Thanks, Kyle.
One of the things I love getting to chat with people about is folks who have sort of seen this like broad evolution of a company from the very early days into becoming a much more formidable sort of beast. Definitely, it feels like Lucid has continued to evolve, add new products, expand as a business, and you've been there from the very early days. And so what I'd love to start with is just a little bit of that snapshot of where the sort of Lucid story started, how you got involved in the company in the beginning, and how it's kind of come to where it is today. And then maybe we can dig in a little bit on some of the products and things like that. But I'd love to get to hear the snapshot story of how you've got to where you are.
Excellent. Well, I will dive in and mix and weave the personal story along with the company's story.
That sounds great.
It was about 12 years ago. I was at Bain & Company, a big consulting firm, and I got a call from Carl Sun, one of our founders. And he told me, we have this great product and we need someone to come help us figure out and grow the business. And as he started telling me, and more importantly, showing me the product, which was the initial version of Lucidchart, I quickly caught the vision of what they were talking about. At the time, I had just spent many months on a big project with a major aerospace and defense company, helping them redesign their engineering processes of how to build helicopters. And I had done all of that in PowerPoint. A tool never designed for that kind of complexity or collaboration. And so when I saw Lucidchart for the first time, my mind immediately went to how much time I could have saved and how much more impactful the collaboration could have been as part of that project. And so I joined Carl and Ben in the basement in the very early days when we had a few thousand users. I was employee number 4 alongside the two of them and one other engineer, and essentially zero in revenue. And at the time, again, we had Lucidchart, which Ben had built really from his own needs. When he had been the CTO of another software startup, building a complex product in a highly regulated space. And so he and his team needed to be aligned on exactly how they were going to design and build the architecture of this company and the product. And as he started going through that, he became frustrated with the tools that existed at the time. And so like a great engineer, he just started building nights and weekends the solution that he needed. And that ultimately evolved into Lucidchart. And as he initially released it online with a basic message, I think, around core diagramming brought to the web with collaboration at its core, he immediately recognized that this was a much broader pain point that he and his team were feeling that was much more universal than he'd originally imagined, because so many teams needed to come together and collaborate to bring clarity to the complex.
I love that. One of the things that is really interesting, and I'm curious to hear your perspective sort of from those early days to now, it feels like you guys have been a part of a sort of movement that has moved into the mainstream. Like I feel like this sort of, needing to collaborate, visualize, do all this stuff. To your point, like you were doing it in PowerPoint, which probably like give Microsoft credit. Their products are probably the ones that have been stretched to the limits for use cases they were never imagined for.
Right.
When you went out in those early days to have conversations to talk about Lucidchart, how people could use it, were you met with an immediate aha? Was it sort of like there was some education? And I mean, now today it feels like everybody wants to have these tools that they can very easily understand their workflows and things like that. But in the early days, was it like you have to like bring people along that journey?
I think there has always been a key component of education in this journey. Because in the early days, again, part of what we were replacing was the incumbent of Microsoft Visio. Yeah. And so the folks who understood that historical diagramming market immediately understood the value.
Sure.
But that was a small fraction of our vision because we believed essentially from the beginning that all knowledge workers could be and should be using visual collaboration more broadly. But along the way, we've had to, I think, one, help cast that vision, and then two, of course, back it up with product and capabilities to deliver on that vision. So let me give you one very simple example. In the early days, a lot of our users were more technical, and that still remains a core component of our user base today, but it's broadened over time, and I'll give you the example of sales. If you sat down with a great salesperson, they probably would not think of themselves as someone who would diagram, for example, use that verb.
Yeah.
But then if you say, well, tell me about the deal that you are trying to close right now. Who are all the players? What's their relationships? And walk me through the landscape, if you will, of the company that you are trying to sell into. And as you start to talk through that use case, they say, oh, actually, I have something like that. It's called an account map.
Yeah,
whether that's or actually down on paper.
Yeah.
And so, along the way, again, for sales specifically, we built out some of that initial messaging. We then built templates. We then built, the capabilities where we could interact directly with Salesforce and pull all that information automatically and help them have that starting point. And so for each of these different groups, if you will, we have to cast the vision for how visual collaboration is so critical and is better than what they are doing today. And so along the way, you're absolutely right. We've seen the growth from, I think, what historically people would have thought as a niche application, to something today that I think people who are forward-looking absolutely recognize that this can, should, and will be used by the vast majority of knowledge workers in the years to come.
Yeah, totally. Well, and you can see that also. You look at the sort of success you all have had, and you go from different areas of education and bringing people along. But today, I mean, you're just looking at some of the customers you have, right? You've got Amazon and Google and I think NASA. Like these are big organizations. So it's very clear that's become a common part of these large organizations, lots of people, collaboration becomes more complex, and so you want to have these sort of systems laid out. In your mind, do you see it as, this is sort of now become common, but it's largely common as a big company problem, or is it different stages of a company's life? They need these types of tools, they just need them for different reasons or in different ways?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the latter part of that, because when we take a step back and think about the workflow, essentially all teams go through this very common workflow from idea to reality. And yes, that workflow looks different based on the stage and scale of the company. It can look a little bit different by function or by team, but essentially all teams are going through that. It can start with brainstorming and ideating as a team, to decision-making, to planning, to design and documentation, and ultimately to execution. And so along that journey, visual collaboration enables teams to communicate and collaborate the way they work best, which is visually. And so when we look at our customer base, that's what we see. It's very representative of the broader knowledge user base, if you will, because we have fledgling startups, all the way to, some of the largest and most complex companies in the world. And then when you actually look at the usage within those, it's not just one function. But particularly with our most mature customers, I mean, it's literally every function, every team in the company where visual collaboration has become the standard alongside other key productivity or collaboration applications internally.
Interesting. So walk me through that journey of where in the early days, the flagship product was Lucidchart. You've now expanded, if I understand, the product suite today. You've got Lucidchart, Lucidspark, Lucidscale. What was the timeline? At what point did you realize these are kind of different use cases that merit a different product? Or how did you guys think about evolving the sort of suite of products that you're offering?
Yeah, I think a core sort of philosophy was for us was reaching market leadership. And we did that initially with Lucidchart in that core diagramming space. But the vision for visual collaboration and its breadth and depth for us has always been there from the beginning. But we invested heavily along the way in Lucidchart, both from a distribution perspective as well as from a product perspective, but also in the underlying platform in such a way that would allow us to expand and scale innovation along the way. And so how did that actually happen? Well, essentially, we built and focused on Lucidchart for the first 9 years of the company. So a long time, again, reached that market leadership, reached significant scale, tens of millions of users, hundreds of millions of ARR. And then as we, of course, went into the pandemic, that's when I think some of those needs began to become more clear than they had historically. And so we had a lot of customers coming to us in the early days of the pandemic where they, of course, had all been forced into a remote situation and saying, we love Lucidchart. We often use it for some of these other use cases, including brainstorming and ideation, but we'd love a purpose-built experience for that. And we said, we hear you, we get it. And so again, we took a step back and thought about that workflow from idea to reality, and where Lucidchart was exceptional at it, but where we believe there could be an outsized role for a different product experience. And so that's when we decided to build Lucidspark, our virtual whiteboard, which would pair seamlessly with Lucidchart in that workflow. And so, from the day we decided to build it to the day we launched it to enterprise customers was 4 months, which is incredibly fast. And it was not because Lucidspark is a simple product in any form, but rather was because we had invested nearly a decade in the underlying platform of visual collaboration. And so we were able to leverage so much of that from Lucidchart to quickly build a powerful product in Lucidspark and take advantage of the collaboration and the integrations and the deep administration and security, the data and automation, all of those capabilities that underlied the core platform now allowed us to move quickly to service some of these new needs that had emerged for our customers in a very real way.
That's super interesting. And tell me a little bit, because collaboration is becoming much more common in a lot of different products, right? And you look at things like Figma taking designers and putting them into a collaborative environment. But when you realize what you guys had been doing in collaboration more broadly, it's like there's so many different use cases that were already in Lucidcharts experiencing this sort of live collaboration. Maybe in terms of from a product perspective, are there certain things that were immediately transferable into that digital whiteboarding experience, whether it is the drag and drop interface, the having multiple editors in one place at one time? What were the core building blocks that allowed you to do that so quickly in 4 months?
Yeah, I think fundamentally a lot of that revolved around having an intelligent canvas. And when I say intelligent canvas, that means more than just having boxes and arrows or sticky notes, but actually what those imply on the canvas and their relationship to potentially to other data. So let me give you an example of that. I mentioned the Salesforce example earlier, where we created this bi-directional sync within Lucidchart to create these account maps for go-to-market teams. Well, when it came to Lucidspark, one of those very common experiences or workflows that teams would go through is do that initial brainstorming and ideation, but then immediately want to go into planning mode. Okay, we talked about potential ideas, we've synthesized those ideas, and now we're actually going to move into planning. We were able to leverage that same data and automation capabilities to build a deep integration with Jira. And so you could actually turn those ideas immediately into Jira tasks and build out the complex plans for the coming quarter or even sprints and so on. And so again, having an intelligent canvas, not just a great place for people to drag and drop, but also the data and automation capabilities underneath was a critical one. Certainly the collaboration capabilities came over very naturally. The collaboration can sometimes look different between those two use cases. In Lucidchart, where you're often diagramming out the people and the processes and systems that underlie your organization, sometimes that's synchronous. A lot of times it's asynchronous, where one person may take the lead and say, here's how this complex process looks today, and others can come in and edit and collaborate and comment and so on. Whereas in the digital whiteboarding space, you're often bringing together 5 or 50 or even 500 people at the same time, to brainstorm and ideate together. And so there were some nuances there, but the underlying capabilities, transferred very quickly, I think, to those use cases. And so when we think about, again, that workflow, idea to reality, I come back to that a lot. We think about the big verbs, if you will, and ideation and planning, happens predominantly in Lucidspark. Design and documentation of your people, processes, and systems to bring those ideas and plans to life is really where Lucidchart excels tremendously, and that's why there's this very natural workflow between the two.
And what about in terms of, if I'm understanding you correctly, you guys do a really good job of, you spent sort of a better part of a decade building out this sort of core infrastructure. Now that unlocks you to be able to say, all right, where are the places where people are spiking, whether it's a specific use case or kind of job to be done, right? Whether it's on the brainstorming side. It seems like, and I know less about LucidScale as a product, just have been kind of digging around the website and things. From my understanding outside in, it feels like this sort of very specific use case where people are using it, wanting to visualize their cloud environment, understanding what resources are being leveraged where and things like that. That strikes me as something that I would imagine a lot of your customers are doing. Is that an example of you noticed something that was so consistent that it similarly deserved a deliberately built environment? And do you think you'll build a lot more of those kinds of things? Or how did you think about that kind of expansion?
It's a great question. And when you have 60 million users over a decade, you have so many data points of how people are using it. And for years, I think I continued to be surprised at all the diverse use cases that people had. But of course, there's these common themes, that emerge when you give them these common set of tools. And Lucidscale is a great example of that. When we looked at the data and use cases, we realized there were tens of thousands, if not more, of enterprise architects and DevOps teams and others who were designing and documenting their cloud architecture in Lucidchart. And they loved it for that use case. But they were also doing it in a relatively manual way. Through drag and drop, to go through that design and documentation process that you would need to educate your team, that you would need for compliance reasons, that you would need to understand your security protocols and so on. And so we've looked at that need and recognized we can obviously help take this a step further. And that's when we did that integration with AWS and GCP and Azure to be able to pull down all the complex data around your cloud architecture. There is so much metadata that exists in that kind of system and help you visualize it instantaneously. And then have different views of how you actually want to drill in and understand what's going on. And so that was a deep enough use case and a common enough use case that we said, that deserves perhaps a separate purpose-built experience around that, for that powerful use case. Now, when we think about, the potential of where that could go, it's an interesting question, because certainly there are, I think, lots of great flavors and themes like that where we could similarly build out purpose-built experiences. At the same time, I think a core part of our philosophy moving forward is ensuring that we have the right developer platform and APIs and partner ecosystem so that others, particularly who may be subject matter experts in all of these different use cases, can help take the broad horizontal tool set that we have in Lucidchart and Lucidspark and design more of these experiences built on top of it. And so whether we continue to build those out from a first-party perspective or partner with folks from a third-party perspective, there's absolutely strong potential to continue to pull out those common themes and provide even deeper experiences than we do today.
There's two buckets there I want to dig into because it's really fascinating. The first is thinking about everybody vies to be a system of record for every customer, right? They want to be the place that people rely on as this like source of truth or what have you. Do you find that that's very common in your customers, that you have become this sort of system of record in a sense of this is the source of truth for the way that our systems work? Or is that a constant battle to try and encourage your customers to say, hey, this isn't just a, make the flow chart and it's like, yep, that's a thing. And then you move on, right? It's like, this is actually a system of record. What's that conversation been like with your customers?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a maturity curve there, as you would expect. And I think part of that education that I talked about earlier is about casting that vision for both individual users and then more broadly for customers, particularly as they start getting hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of users on the platform. And I think you're absolutely right that a core part of our strategy from the very beginning has been to be the most integrated. And some of those are simple integrations, where perhaps you need, the visual of the software architecture in Jira so you know how to build it. But increasingly, there's a lot of depth, and bi-directional syncs and a lot of power, that happens. So yes, we can pull in, all of that information from Salesforce and be that, complementary, if you will, visual layer to that system of record. But help your go-to-market teams, pre-sales, post-sales, understand the account, the key players, and so on. Similarly, we can do that with Jira. We can do with other work management systems. We can do that with your HRIS systems. We can do that with a number of different types. And so when you think about the kind of the core enterprise applications that run a business, oftentimes they are not great at communicating that information in a digestible visual way. And so because we have those deep integrations, Lucid becomes and often does become, particularly for our more mature customers, that repository of your ideas, certainly, and even if some of those are a little more ephemeral over time, but also of the people, processes, and systems that run your business. Because if you think about how companies have to innovate, so much still runs on tribal knowledge today. And that slows down innovation. Because if I want to know how something works, someone's going to say, well, go talk to Jill in accounting, and then, talk to Joe in finance, and then you might need to talk to the internal systems team as well. And whereas, instead, if I want to innovate and make our quote to cash process, tremendously more efficient, if I know how it works today, it is much faster and easier to start developing how it should look tomorrow. And so I think absolutely integrations is a fundamental part of our story, and where we focus a lot with our customers. From the very beginning, we've seen the data that if a customer had one integration, that was one of the most significant leading factors of how likely they were to expand and renew. And then that would just compound over time, because I think it represents both us becoming a fundamental part of their workflows, along with becoming, again, that visual record alongside all of their other enterprise systems.
So how does that translate into pricing? So is it based on the number of charts that people are creating, number of seats? Is there an integration function? How do you think about translating that sort of value creation that you've just described into value capture for Lucid?
Today, our pricing remains simple, which is seat-based. While I think we have explored and thought about different pricing and packaging models we could take, I think for the most part, we've wanted to remove as much friction as possible. Right? We want you to become deeply integrated. We're not going to charge you extra for that. Yep. We want you to use these deep collaboration features. We're not going to charge you extra for that, and so on and so forth. Certainly that may evolve over time, but I think today we've tried to make it as frictionless as possible to become deeply ingrained within the workflows very naturally within the customer.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So the other kind of bucket I wanted to dig into, and some of the things you had mentioned that I think is really interesting, is sort of this infrastructure as a service play that it seems like you are kind of capable of today. At least you've only done it for yourself, but you look at that sort of first 10 years, building this really deep collaborative infrastructure. There's lots of these different functions. And we talked a little bit earlier about how common collaboration is becoming as a feature set for other products. One of the things that's been really interesting for me to observe is that it feels like more so people are trying to sort of not have to reinvent the wheel every time somebody wants to build a product that is collaborative. There are some companies, I don't know if you've come across like Live Blocks and things like that are trying to sort of bundle these collaborative features, offer them as a service. The way that you kind of described what you guys had done with Scale, I think is a really interesting example of like, hey, we have a sort of infrastructure platform, if you will, right? We have the foundation upon which to build. And if we want to build in this direction, great. If we want to build in that direction, awesome. Is that something that you would consider as a sort of standalone offering where you can go to, or maybe it's something you're already doing today? You'd mentioned that this was sort of on your mind as something where if I am a total third party company, I want to build a collaborative X, right? I want to have this sort of deep collaborative tissue, but my real expertise is, maybe it's, as a good example, I could take Lucidscale before you built it. Maybe one of the cloud providers comes and they say, hey, we constantly have customers who are trying to map out their cloud environment. We'd love to build this collaborative environment where they can do that, but we don't want to spend all this effort to build this foundation. We'd love to use you guys and build on top of that. How do you think about that as a potential thing that you can extend to these potential third parties?
I think that could absolutely be part of the evolution of the platform here, because there's no need, to your point, to reinvent the wheel. A collaborative, intelligent canvas can and should be used in a whole host of diverse use cases. Across essentially every function, there are those deep use cases, many of which are manifested today in Lucidchart and Lucidspark usage, but many which I think could be built upon and taken to a deeper level and really customized to that specific use case in such a way that we never will, because there's thousands of them. But as you think about those different potential providers out there, startups, all the way to more established companies, that need for a collaborative, intelligent canvas is absolutely one that we could fill. And so we're taking, I think, steps in that direction initially by exposing a lot more APIs that allow you to, bring in other data, even change some of the user experience within our products today to really customize that workflow. But I think certainly it could evolve over time to go a step further where we become that collaborative, intelligent canvas that everybody knows that's what they could and should use, rather than investing a lot of time into what would, for them, would be non-core capabilities.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So switching gears a little bit, you mentioned COVID was kind of a really interesting sort of unveiling of this particular use case. Obviously there are companies out there like Miro that had been around for a little while, similarly really took off during the pandemic. I think if I've got my timelines right, you guys launched Lucidspark towards the end of 2020. I think Figma launched FigJam maybe in April or May of 2021. So COVID was definitely this aha moment for folks to think about this whiteboarding space. When you looked out there and you saw the Miros of the world, you maybe considered the fact that other collaborative companies like Figma could potentially play in this market. How did you guys think about your positioning? What made you different? What sort of advantage did you have getting into that market?
Yeah, great question. And I think when we thought about it, took a step back, it was really about this workflow from idea to reality and the end-to-end nature that we could play as that platform. Because again, ideation and brainstorming is a critical part of the process, but it is one major step. Because when you get to the end of that, the most important thing that you've now come to is, what are we going to do next? And rather than having to go to a variety of other platforms, again, a lot of that can flow very naturally into Lucidchart to take those next steps to design and develop the people, processes, the systems that are required to bring that to life. And so I think that's been I think a very critical part of the messaging and the positioning for us is one common workflow, one common platform, one common experience, one common partner in that, rather than having multiple of those. And so today it's not uncommon, and I think it's actually increasingly common for us to be having these conversations, particularly in this environment, where we can come in and say, we understand you may be using that tool for whiteboarding, you may be using that tool for diagramming, you may be using that tool for org charting, and so on and so forth. Let us show you the way that you can have a much more cohesive and powerful user experience, while also potentially providing a deeper and better partnership with one partner, one vendor. And so that has continued to play out, and I think gained actually increasing momentum over time, in part because of the economic situation, and in part because I think a lot of companies are now taking a step back and taking a breather. So much technology and so much change was adopted in a pretty hastily fashioned way, and rightfully so, given the circumstances. But now companies are taking a step back and saying, these Band-Aids we put in place or these solutions we picked for a year or two may not be the right way we want to future-proof our organization. And so they're reevaluating, I think, the partners, the tool set, and so on. And that's where I think our end-to-end differentiation has really stood out for the vast majority of our customers.
Interesting. Is there anywhere where, and I think this is something that the current economic environment has also kind of awoken people to some extent, where in the last couple of years, people got into this attitude of where, endless capital, whatever, made people feel like, I want to be the everything for everyone. I want to do all of the things for all of the people. And I think there is this balance between what you're describing, which is effectively rebundling some of these functions that are very logically go together. And then there's the sort of like expansive vision of the people who it's like, I don't even care if it is a logical extension. I want to try and be everything to everyone. And I think that is, to some extent, there is a balance there of to some people getting anxious about, well, if you're everything to everyone, how can you really be good at something? Are there situations where you step back and say, hey, like if you're, this kind of company, or if the specific use case is this kind of use case, we might not be the best fit. Like, how have you thought about positioning yourself, and where are there places where it makes more sense for somebody to go with a competitor? Or is it like you guys are become such a general purpose tool with Lucidchart that you really can own almost every use case you've come across?
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting evolution to watch it play out, right? Because I think so many people were trying to raise money at really significant valuations. And to do that, you had to cast this really broad vision. Yep. And so, the historical swim lanes all of a sudden got very messy between companies as they started encroaching on each other's historical territory. And I think that's natural, to occur, but I think it got accelerated, tremendously during that time. And so, I think when we look at it, generally speaking with visual collaboration, there's few places we shouldn't be the dominant and single standard for visual collaboration. Now, along the way, and we just talked about this with being the most integrated, right? We also stress where we are complementary, right? We are not going to be your work management system. We have some basic functionality there, but really, that's why we deeply integrate with Smartsheet and Asana and Jira and others. Similarly, sometimes people come to us and because of the nature of our products, ask us, do you also replace Figma? No. Obviously, Figma is a tremendously powerful product, in that visual design space. And again, we serve a very complementary use case there and have integrated where you can pull in, Figma mocks and designs directly into Lucidspark as part of, that idea to reality workflow. And so I think while we have broadened the product portfolio very deliberately, we also recognize where we can be best of breed, versus where we're going to, right now at least, defer to others in those spaces. And I think that's important because I talk to CIOs and others all the time. And yes, people want a consistent experience. They want fewer vendors. They want better commercials. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of CIOs today, even as the pendulum is swung back, are not excited to go rip out admired tools from their users. And so in all of these cases where we may be replacing existing tool sets, we have to come in and win the hearts and minds of users. It still fundamentally comes down to being the best product for both the end user as well as for the organization and the leadership as well.
Yeah, totally. And I'm curious how that translates then into the customer base. When you think about, again, we talked about this, you've got a lot of very large organizations, you've got startups, you've got all shapes and sizes in your customer base. And you mentioned a little bit of the commonality where a lot of times it's people using multiple of your products. Is it something where Lucidchart is still very much the flagship product, most common thing that people start on and then they expand into things like Lucidspark? Or are you seeing folks that are maybe have never heard of Lucid, maybe don't do a lot of diagramming, but they're hearing about you because of Lucidspark, and that gives you that wedge to then talk about, hey, like, that idea that you're having, let's talk about how you could turn that into a sort of long-term system design exercise, or what's that conversation been like?
Yeah, it probably comes as no surprise that given that we were in the market for nearly a decade with Lucidchart before Lucidspark, there is a lot of brand equity built up in Lucidchart. Of those tens of millions of users, who adopted the product and used it at different times. And so we are still probably better known for Lucidchart today, but that is certainly changing. And one of the key decisions we made late last year was we wanted to make Lucidchart and Lucidspark a single suite and deliver it in that way to all of our customers. When we launched Lucidspark, we initially launched it as a separate product with separate pricing. You, of course, could buy the two together, but predominantly we saw people buying them somewhat separately, where maybe there was an existing customer that had 1,000 Lucidchart licenses, and now they were adopting Lucidspark, but perhaps more slowly or in slightly different functions, and so they had 200 Lucidspark licenses. And as we saw that play out, we were seeing great growth in Lucidspark as an independent product as well. But we come back to our mission, and we come back to that workflow from idea to reality, and we say we want every user to have all of these capabilities. And so, again, let's reduce the friction as much as possible. Let's bundle them together in one suite, and let's ensure that every user has access to Lucidspark, Lucidchart, so that they can have that complete and full experience. And so over the course of the last 6 to 12 months, we've transitioned the vast majority of our customers to that model, and they have very much embraced it. And I think it's eased the conversation significantly to drive adoption into Lucidspark and also to become the visual collaboration standard within companies rather than one tool alongside others.
So maybe final question on this before we jump to kind of the last few questions that I want to dig into with you. But in this area of kind of visual collaboration and these different use cases that you've described, you think about COVID as very much this inflection point where a lot of people were introduced to tools that maybe they hadn't ever used before, but now it was like the only way to communicate certain ideas. And so they've gotten much more familiar with them. Going forward, the world starts to come back a little bit to normal, like COVID's over and stuff, like you get back into a normal working style. Do you think that it goes back to there are certain types of people that will do this kind of visual collaboration, or do you think this has become such a comfortable learned behavior that going forward it only becomes more so more people are doing whiteboarding, this becomes a more important artifact in the way that people build their businesses?
Yeah, I think our story here looks a little bit differently than perhaps some in the space. We were very successful, before COVID, during COVID, and now after COVID. And that's because I think we've built the products and the value proposition in such a way that it's valuable to people who are working remotely, valuable to people who are working hybrid, and valuable to people who are working in person. And candidly, that's just not true of all the tools, broadly speaking, in the software and collaboration space. They gained a lot of momentum over the last couple of years. And so I think that's going to separate some of the companies from the past couple of years to the next few of who can really add that creativity, the collaboration, the productivity across any mode of work. Because the vast majority of companies, large and small, are going to have some mix of that. And so, I even think about my own personal use case. When I bring together our executive team, sometimes we do those remotely, oftentimes we do them in person. Regardless how we do it, we are in Lucid, using that as the way to drive engagement and brainstorming and ideation and decision-making and so on, because it is just much more effective, even if we were all in the same room together. And so I think that is going, again, to define some of the success between the last couple of years and the next couple, and why we have so much confidence that this is an enduring trend. We don't have customers coming back to us who are saying, well, actually, now we're 3 days or 4 days in the office, and so we're going to cut back on licenses. I haven't had a single conversation like that, not one with customers.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, there's other reasons why customers may be, thinking about things, particularly with this economy, but not one is about this trend of, what work like's moving forward, because I think we've proven our value regardless of the mode of work.
It's such an interesting, and it's such a good callback to your sort of core driving ethos, right? Of this idea from taking everything from idea to reality, that entire workflow. If I'm kind of saying the part that, or reading between the lines a little bit of the experience that you're having, it sounds like some of these tools who primarily are just focused on helping you with the idea, they are probably experiencing a bit of a spike, right? Where it's like it was much harder to talk about and visualize these ideas when you're not in person. And so you saw a huge spike of it during COVID, and now it's kind of come down, or you see people go back to different ways of doing things. But for folks who are trying to map out this entire process from end to end, they need a tool that can do that. You guys haven't experienced that same spike per se because you still continue to see value in taking that idea, going through different phases of diagramming and things like that. So it's allowed you guys to sort of, you to ride that longevity in a way that probably other products haven't.
I think that's summarized very well.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, I have to ask you this question because I think you sit at a very interesting intersection. I've been in the Lucid offices. I know that they're beautiful. They're enjoyable. I've got a lot of friends that work there and love it. So I know that you guys have a great in-person culture. I don't know how much. I'd imagine you've got folks in lots of different places, but you sort of sit this balance where like I know a lot of you are working in the office, but you are probably the best friend of a lot of remote first companies. Like they value very much the ability to visualize their processes. And so where do you fall in the debate of in-person versus remote work, and how do you think about that both generally for everyone and in the way that you build Lucid?
Well, this is certainly a topic that is top of mind it feels like almost every conversation I have, with our customers as well as peer CEOs. And I certainly don't claim to have all the answers on it. That said, we've strongly encouraged and asked our teams who are around hubs to come in a couple of days a week, because I believe that there is some great power and energy, particularly around culture, around learning more quickly, particularly in an evolving competitive or economic environment, and so on and so forth, that comes from some of that in-person interaction. I was talking to the CEO of another company, and he put a pretty strong take on it when he said, every day you're remote, you're sacrificing the soul of your company.
Wow.
That's pretty extreme.
Spicy take, yeah.
Right? It's a spicy take. That said, I think there's some truth to that. For those of us who aren't necessarily, who weren't remote first from the very beginning. There are clearly some remote first who are small, who've grown up that way and built all the processes and technology around it. And that's not to say that we couldn't and shouldn't and aren't adapting. But I believe when possible, having some of that common in-person interaction is important. That said, we all enjoy the flexibility and we all enjoy some of the productivity we get from home. I think what has resonated with me along the way through this journey is some of the studies that have consistently come out, which essentially said productivity stayed relatively high throughout the last couple of years. What suffered, though, both from the perception of employees as well as in results, was creativity and collaboration. And so, I think as we look forward, we're going to see, both the continued need for solutions like Lucid that support that creativity and collaboration regardless of the circumstance, but also I think balancing, the needs and flexibility of remote with having some of that in-person interaction along the way.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Dave, this has been super fun. It's awesome to get to sort of thread that needle of the experience you guys have had as you've evolved and really put in the work to be able to be a long-lasting solution. So really appreciate you walking me through the story and taking the time to chat.
Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate it.